Hello again. Today I'm going to make a video about what's called the composite novel. What's that, I hear you ask? Well, since it impacts on one of my own books, I thought it would make sense to actually talk a little bit about it and try and explain as well as I can what that concept involves. Okay, the composite novel, what is it? Well, generally speaking, collections of short stories could simply be an author taking a number of stories that they've written, possibly over many years, and then putting them into a collection and publishing them as a book. In that particular instance, there was no intention on the part of the author initially to actually write particular stories. These might have come about simply as the result of inspiration, for example, and as I say, over a long period of gestation. And the author has simply decided that I've got 15, 20 stories now, let's publish them as a collection. Now, you will find that even in any collection that there will be some thought given to the actual order of the stories in that collection. You might think, for example, if there were 15 stories, for argument's sake, you might think to yourself, well, story number 1 needs to be pretty powerful as an opener, and you might look at number 5, number 10, and then obviously the last story in the collection in terms of being like road markers along the way. But apart from that, the collection itself is pretty disparate. There's no sense in a collection like that that those stories combine together to make up something else. They are separate stories in their own right. You can read them separately. And once you've read all the stories in that particular collection, they don't add up to some hidden or some greater meaning. Okay. Now, with a composite novel, that's very different indeed. Possibly the most famous composite novel ever written, and certainly one of the most influential, is James Joyce's Dubliners. I've got a copy of that here. There it is, Dubliners. And what makes Dubliners a composite novel is that Joyce deliberately arranged the stories in a particular order. In other words, the stories couldn't be reproduced in a different order to the one which you will find in that collection. And there are other features, other organising principles at work in that collection. First thing to say about Dubliners, or the first thing to mention, is the title itself, Dubliners. What you'll find is that there is no story in that collection with that particular title. The title basically is an all-embracing term that refers to the collection. And that's quite an easy way to identify a composite novel. So, for example, you would look at an example here of another famous composite novel. This is Winesburg, Ohio by Sherwood. Again, it's the title that's important there. If you look inside, there is no story with that particular name. So, a composite novel has a number of features, a number of structural features that differentiate it from a standard collection of short stories. One of the ways you can do that is having a protagonist who basically is to be found throughout all the stories. It's something that I do with my collection, which is called The Prison. I've got an unnamed protagonist, but it's quite clear when you read the stories that it's the same person all the way through. In a sense, when you talk about Dubliners, you could almost make the argument that Dubliners themselves are a kind of collective protagonist in that collection. Although the stories are about different people, they act together, as I say, to form a kind of collective protagonist. Probably the best book to read on the subject is this one, the Composite novel. It basically explains how in the 70s there were various ideas and theories put forward, and people came up with different titles, different ways of categorizing what we generally now call a composite novel. One of the ways that you can do that is by referring to what's called a short story cycle. That's in the same sort of vein as you would find in music, in classical music, where you would talk about a song cycle. So Winterreise or Die schöne Müllerin is a song cycle, and Mahler and other composers wrote similar sort of song cycles. But the word that, or the phrase that's actually become more common these days is composite novel. So I've mentioned that you could have a collective protagonist, you could have an individual protagonist who narrates all of the stories. That's something that I do in my collection, which is here. This is the prison. You can do that. You can have the same location throughout, which of course is the case with Dubliners and also with Winesburg, Ohio. Same location all the time. And the other structural principle, the other organizing principle, is namely theme. With Joyce, he famously expressed that in a letter where he said that the theme of Dubliners is one of paralysis. So all 15 stories in the collection exemplify that theme of paralysis. And again, if I go back to my collection, the theme is imprisonment, a fairly similar theme, because I'm riffing on Joyce's collection. So the other thing that I would mention, it relates to what I said earlier, is that when you take a composite novel, such as Dubliners, such as my own collection, the actual sum of its parts is greater than what you would find in a simple collection of short stories. Once you have read the collection, the short stories impact on one another. You get greater knowledge about the character in mine, you learn more about him. But the stories, as I say, have like a cumulative effect. And that's not really the case in the run-of-the-mill short story collection. That then, in essence, is what a composite novel is. It's a fascinating way of writing a sort of precursor to the novel, if you like. But as I say, it allows you to try out many different ideas, and I think it's a very interesting medium to use. And I particularly enjoyed writing the stories for mine. And in terms of my collection, the one point I would make is that in terms of structure, once again, there is only one way it can be structured. In my case, it's chronological. So I begin with stories of childhood, and then I end with stories of maturity, of adulthood. So they can't be swapped around. They have to be in the order that they occupy. And the other point to make on that is that originally in the first edition there were only 10 stories, and I added 2 more. So once I'd added those 2, I made sure that I'd written stories one from childhood and one from manhood, so that the collection would still balance. That was the important thing. So I hope I've given a brief and concise elucidation of what a composite novel is, and I hope that increases your enjoyment when you actually come to read such a collection yourself.